The morning sun broke over Ouagadougou with a brilliance that seemed almost intentional, as if the heavens themselves wanted to cast light on what would become a day etched into history. The streets hummed with the familiar sounds of the capital vendors, opening their stalls, children's laughter echoing in the courtyards, the faint calls to prayer floating across the rooftops. Yet, behind the tall gates of the presidential residence, a storm was already gathering. Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain who had risen from the ranks of Burkina Faso's military to become its leader, sat at his desk. Before him lay a cream-colored envelope, heavy with the weight of its contents. The gold seal of the British crown gleamed under the soft light, its wax unbroken but its intent already clear. When his aide had delivered it minutes earlier, the room had fallen into an almost sacred silence, as though the paper itself carried echoes of centuries past. His fingers hovered over the seal. He knew what this was, and more importantly, what it represented. A summons, not a request from the crown. And sure enough, when the wax cracked and the elegant script unfolded, the words confirmed his instinct. His Majesty King Charles III requested his presence at a private ceremony during the monarch's African tour, scheduled in Accra. Requested. But Ibrahim had lived long enough and read enough history to understand what such requests truly meant. To decline would be seen as an insult. To accept would mean subjecting himself to protocols designed not for equals, but for subjects. His foreign minister broke the silence, her voice quiet but resolute. "They will expect you to bow." The sentence carried no more than 6 words, yet it cut through the air sharper than any blade. The word bow was heavy, echoing like a chain dragging across stone. The irony pressed upon everyone in that room. Here was a leader who had built his reputation on defiance, who had insisted that Africa must stand unshaken before former colonizers, now being summoned like a subordinate. It was as if history was testing him, putting before him the same theater of humiliation that his ancestors had endured. Would he yield, even symbolically, or would he find another path? Traoré leaned back, his eyes drifting toward the open window. Outside, the Burkina Faso flag swayed gently red for revolution, green for hope, and a golden star at its center. A flag born of resistance, not inheritance. Each movement of that fabric seemed to whisper reminders, dignity, freedom, sovereignty. He thought of the stories passed down by his grandfather, stories of chiefs forced to kneel, of warriors made to remove their sandals before pale strangers who claimed authority, simply by carrying a foreign crown's blessing. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper, now as if carried on the wind. The day we stop bowing is the day we truly become free. The letter trembled in his grip, but not from fear, from fury, from the raw energy of generations who had endured degradation, disguised as protocol. But fury alone would not suffice. Fury had toppled empires, but it had also consumed revolutions. What was required now was clarity, a decision that would echo, not just across headlines, but across history. He rose from his chair, pacing the length of the mahogany table that once belonged to colonial administrators. That table itself was a relic, a piece of furniture that had witnessed decades of orders, passed down from outsiders, who considered this land nothing more than a resource to be extracted. Now, it bore witness to a son of Burkina Faso considering whether to repeat the patterns of the past or break them entirely. His advisors watched him in silence, each of them carrying their own memories of humiliation. One recalled his father being forced to salute a colonial officer who could barely pronounce the names of the villages he ruled. Another thought of his grandmother, who had told him in hushed tones about the time women were required to curtsy before the wives of administrators, their backs aching not from the motion but from the indignity. These were not just personal stories. They were collective scars. Traoré stopped pacing and turned to face them, his voice calm but weighted. "Prepare for Accra, but hear me clearly. We go as equals, or we do not go at all." The room exhaled collectively, as if centuries of suppressed defiance had found its voice in that single sentence. The die was cast, and yet the true test still lay ahead. Days later, the convoy pulled into Accra. The British High Commissioner's residence loomed like an echo of the empire. White pillars, manicured lawns, chandeliers inside that glittered with stolen opulence. It was a stage, and everyone knew the script. African leaders were to enter, bow, and salute, their gestures captured by cameras that would beam the images across the globe. reinforcing an old narrative of subservience disguised as diplomacy. But this time, the script was about to be torn apart. Inside the ceremonial hall, King Charles stood waiting beneath a portrait of Queen Victoria. His uniform glittered with medals, each one a token of military campaigns that spanned continents, most of them soaked in blood that was not British. Around him, diplomats, dignitaries, and photographers waited like an audience at a theater. They had seen this performance countless times. They knew the choreography. What they didn't know was that today, the script had changed. When Ibrahim entered, his posture was straight, his expression calm, his uniform modest compared to the opulence of the surroundings. But his presence carried a gravity that the gilded chandeliers could not overshadow. Every step he took was deliberate, echoing across marble floors designed to intimidate. Yet, instead of shrinking beneath their cold brilliance, he seemed to draw strength from the contrast. He was, after all, the son of a soil that had never accepted chains, only resisted them. Charles extended his hand, the gesture casual, confident, carrying centuries of unspoken assumption. And here, the entire room braced itself. Cameras clicked into readiness. Officials leaned forward. They expected the bow, the salute, the ritual of submission that had defined relations for generations. But Ibrahim did not bow. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his hand over his heart. Fingers splayed across the fabric of his uniform. His eyes locked with Charles's, not in defiance, but in clarity. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying through the hall with a resonance that seemed larger than the man himself. "I greet you as one leader to another, as equals in service to our peoples." The silence that followed was thunderous. Cameras clicked, but the photographers were no longer smiling. Diplomats shifted uneasily. African officials present felt something shift inside them, a spell broken, a weight lifted. For the first time in living memory, the script had not been followed. The ritual had not been performed. And in that absence, a new possibility was born. Charles's smile faltered. His hand hung in the air, suspended like a question mark. For a moment, the centuries themselves seemed to pause, uncertain of what came next. In that stillness, Ibrahim's gesture carried more dignity than any bow could, more respect than any salute ever forced. It was a declaration without aggression, a revolution without violence, a reminder that respect freely given is worth infinitely more than submission demanded. And in that hall, under the painted eyes of monarchs long gone, history quietly shifted its course. The room was frozen in time, caught between the echo of the old world and the faint heartbeat of something new. For those who had gathered expecting the predictable, this breach of protocol landed like a thunderclap. The cameras continued their relentless clicking, but even the most seasoned photographers could feel it. The frame had shifted. This was no longer an image of ceremony. It was the birth of symbolism. Charles's fingers twitched before lowering to his side, his smile strained but holding. He had been trained for every scenario a monarch might encounter. But this quiet refusal to play his role was uncharted. Diplomats shuffled papers, whispered among themselves, as if searching for a manual that no longer existed. The British aides standing behind the king leaned toward one another, murmuring nervously. They had expected a photo opportunity, a reaffirmation of soft power. What they got instead was a lesson in dignity, given without anger, delivered without apology. Ibrahim's hand remained on his chest, his eyes locked on the king's. The silence grew heavier, yet within it was a strange liberation. It was not an act of aggression, not even a rejection. It was something more dangerous, a redefinition. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone present that Ibrahim Traoré had not simply walked into that hall as a leader of Burkina Faso. He had walked in carrying the weight of generations who had longed to see this exact moment a leader, standing tall, unbent, unbroken. African diplomats lining the walls felt their shoulders square involuntarily, as if the gesture itself had ignited an ancestral spark in their chests. A South African minister would later whisper, "It was like watching a chain snap after centuries." A Ghanaian journalist present that day scribbled furiously into his notebook, aware that the story unfolding before him was not just news, but history. And history is rarely polite. King Charles, to his credit, did not recoil. His smile, though faltering, shifted into something more genuine. Perhaps confusion, perhaps curiosity, perhaps a flicker of respect. He cleared his throat and inclined his head. not in the way that protocol dictated, but as though acknowledging the courage it took to step out of script. The hall exhaled. The performance was broken, and what replaced it was raw, unscripted humanity. "Welcome," Charles finally said, his voice carrying an edge of hesitation. "It is good to meet you." A simple phrase, but its simplicity mattered. It was not the expected ceremonial language of empire. It was ordinary, almost humble, and for that reason, extraordinary. Ibrahim's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "The honor is mutual," he replied, his words carefully chosen. The sentence was light, but its subtext was heavy with centuries. Not honor granted from above to below, but mutual, shared, balanced. The king's aides scribbled furiously, drafting in their minds the press release that would need to reshape this entire encounter. Historic, they would call it. Unprecedented, they might write. But those words would never capture the truth, because what had happened in that room was not simply diplomacy. It was reclamation. Outside, in the streets of Accra, life went on with its usual rhythm. Market stalls buzzed, children darted between taxis. The scent of grilled meat mingled with the ocean breeze. Few knew at that moment what had transpired inside the colonial-style residence. But word spreads fast in Africa, faster than official statements, faster than edited photographs. Rumors traveled on the tongues of those who witnessed it, and by the time the sun dipped behind the horizon, the story had already grown into legend. He refused to bow, they said. He saluted with his heart. In Ouagadougou, the news reached. A gathering of university students crowded around a single phone streaming the event. Their cheers filled the courtyard, a wave of youthful energy erupting into chants of Traore, Traore. For them, it wasn't just about one man. It was about possibility. If he could stand as an equal before a king, whose ancestors had ruled the seas and carved up continents, then perhaps they too could stand equal in the world that still tried to diminish them. Elders heard the story and wept quietly, remembering their own humiliations. Farmers in distant villages repeated it around fires, embellishing it with each telling. He placed his hand on his chest, one said. No, he looked the king in the eye like a lion, said another. And with each retelling, the moment grew, evolving into something larger than life. It became less about protocol and more about principle. Inside his private quarters that night, Ibrahim sat with his leather-bound journal open, the same one that held his grandfather's writings. He traced the faded ink of words written decades ago. They said it was protocol, but we knew it was about breaking our spirits. He closed his eyes and exhaled. Today, the cycle had cracked. He was not naive. He knew the West would not forget this slight, however polite its form. He knew there would be consequences, subtle pressures, diplomatic maneuvers, economic levers pulled in retaliation. But he also knew that some prices were worth paying. For too long, leaders had bowed to avoid discomfort, traded dignity for convenience. That era, he hoped, had ended today. The following morning, newspapers across Africa carried headlines splashed in bold letters. Traore défies protocol. Burkina Faso's leader stands tall. Before the crown. The Western press was more restrained, choosing terms like unconventional and unscripted. But between the lines, the shock was evident. Analysts on talk shows debated whether it was disrespect or simply cultural difference. Diplomats whispered of the dangerous precedent it set. And in African capitals, citizens smiled knowingly. They understood it instinctively. It was not disrespect. It was respect on their own terms. In the weeks that followed, the images circulated endlessly online. A young leader standing with hand over heart, eyes unflinching. The king's hand suspended mid-air, the expression on his face uncertain. Memes erupted. Hashtags spread, and for once, the digital conversation was not about Africa's dependency, but about Africa's dignity. Yet Ibrahim did not bask in the attention. He knew symbolism was powerful, but alone it was not enough. A gesture must become a movement, or it risks fading into the archives of forgotten defiance. He convened his advisors, speaking not with the flourish of a revolutionary, but with the calm of a strategist. We must build on this, he said. Respect is only meaningful if we turn it into opportunity. His team nodded. They understood. The true battle was not in ceremonial halls, but in classrooms, farms, factories, and the hearts of young Africans who had been taught too long that their place was beneath, not beside. The gesture in Accra had lit a spark. Now it was their responsibility to turn that spark into fire. And so the story continued to spread, taking on the rhythm of folklore. In villages, griots added it to their songs. In cities, muralists painted it on walls. Traore with his hand over his heart, standing tall before a backdrop of colonial pillars. In classrooms, teachers spoke of it as a lesson in dignity, weaving it into the larger narrative of Africa's long road toward reclaiming its voice. Each retelling reshaped it, but at its core remained the same truth. A man had chosen equality over protocol, and in doing so, reminded a continent of its worth. By the time international commentators attempted to reframe it as a misunderstanding of tradition, it was too late. The story had already taken root, beyond their reach, beyond their edits. For the people, it was no longer about Charles or Traoré. It was about themselves, about Africa's unbroken spine. And for Ibrahim, it was only the beginning. In the days that followed, the British press scrambled to reframe the encounter. Editorials insisted that King Charles had shown grace under pressure, that the breach of protocol was simply a cultural expression, nothing more. Diplomatic statements were drafted with surgical precision, carefully stripping the moment of its electricity. They called it a meeting of mutual respect, as if reducing it to neutrality could erase the tremor it had sent across continents. But no editorial could contain what had already escaped into the bloodstream of collective memory. For Africans, the story resonated not as a small break from tradition, but as a thunderclap announcing a shift in the weather. On radio shows from Dakar to Nairobi, callers repeated the tale with a pride that swelled in their voices. Young people on social media turned the hand-over-heart gesture into a symbol, their posts overflowing with captions like, "We bow to no one, and Africa stands tall." In Lagos, graffiti artists sprayed it on walls, the image of a soldier saluting with his heart painted beside slogans of liberation. The story traveled like fire across dry savanna, each retelling fanning the flames of dignity long suppressed. Not all were pleased. Western officials spoke in measured tones about the need for diplomatic consistency, while behind closed doors, analysts worried about a domino effect. What if other leaders followed suit? What if the rituals of submission that had quietly reinforced global hierarchies for decades began to crumble a bow here? A salute there, it may seem small, but symbolism is the bedrock of authority. And if the symbols fall, the structures they support begin to wobble. The empire had lost its colonies on paper long ago, but its theater of dominance remained intact. Now, even the theater was under threat. Ibrahim, however, refused to be distracted by noise. For him, the gesture was never about theatrics, it was about truth. And truth, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. Back in Ouagadougou, he convened gatherings not of diplomats, but of farmers, students, artisans, and teachers. He listened to their stories, their struggles, their visions for a Burkina Faso that could thrive without kneeling to anyone. His message was simple but radical. Dignity must be lived, not just performed. If the hand-over-heart gesture was to mean anything, it had to translate into schools built without foreign dictation, industries developed without external permission, and policies shaped by the people, for the people. At night, he returned to his grandfather's journal. One evening, he lingered over a passage that read, "They studied our customs and then used our politeness against us." His fingers traced the words slowly, almost reverently. He whispered aloud, "And now we study theirs, not to imitate, but to undo." In that private moment, he understood that Accra was not the climax of his story, it was the prologue. Across Africa, other leaders felt the ripple. Some quietly admired him, though they did not dare replicate his defiance. Others bristled, fearing the pressure it would place on them from their own citizens. Still, the idea spread like wind. Intangible, yet undeniable. Africa could engage the world as an equal, not as a junior partner waiting for approval. And the world, though reluctant, would eventually have no choice but to adjust. Back in Britain, the photograph of the encounter continued to circulate. For some, it was an embarrassment, a disruption of order. For others, it was a curiosity. But for many young Africans abroad, struggling with identity in lands that often reduced them to stereotypes, it was a revelation. To see one of their own refuse to bow, refuse to enact the centuries-old script of inferiority, was to feel a surge of pride that textbooks had long denied them. Messages poured into Ouagadougou from the diaspora, filled with gratitude. "You gave us back our spine," one letter read. "You made us remember who we are." Yet Ibrahim himself remained unassuming. He often reminded his team that he was no savior, no myth. If this gesture means anything, he told them, it is because it belongs to all of us. I only carried it, but it was you, the people, who gave it power. Still, history has a way of turning men into symbols, regardless of their wishes. And with each passing day, his refusal to bow became less about Ibrahim Traoré the man and more about what he represented, a continent determined to redefine itself. Weeks later, he traveled through rural villages of Burkina Faso, and everywhere he went, children greeted him with the same gesture, hand pressed to chest, eyes alight with pride. Old women extended their palms over their hearts as tears welled in their eyes. Farmers straightened, their backs and raised, their hands in silent salutes of equality. In that repetition, he realized the truth the gesture had already outgrown him. It had become part of the culture, a living act of resistance transformed into a ritual of respect. One evening, beneath the shade of an ancient baobab, he addressed a small crowd gathered in his home village. The air was heavy with the scent of earth after rain, and the cicadas hummed as if lending their voices to his words. When I stood before the king, he told him I did not carry my own pride. I carried yours. The strength I felt was not mine alone. It came from every ancestor who refused to bend, from every mother who taught her child to walk with dignity, from every father who told his son never to forget his name. That day was not my victory. It was ours. The crowd erupted in applause, but he raised his hand gently, quieting them. His tone softened. But remember this, a gesture alone will not build our schools. It will not irrigate our fields. It will not defend us from those who still wish to exploit us. If we want to be equal, then our work must match our words. Our dignity must be lived, not only declared. The words sank deep, carried on the night air into the ears of those who listened with reverence. It was a reminder that history's turning points are never the end, they are beginnings, seeds planted in fertile soil. And so, the story of Accra became less about humiliation and more about awakening. Yes, the king had been left standing, his hand extended in vain. Yes, the moment had unsettled those who believed Africa's place was forever beneath. But the greater truth was this: dignity, once claimed, spreads like light. It cannot be unseen. It cannot be undone. The bow withheld that day was not an insult. It was an invitation for the world to meet Africa not as subject, not as supplicant, but as sovereign. In the quiet that followed, history leaned forward, listening. For centuries, the script had been rehearsed, repeated, perfected. But now, at last, a new script was being written, not in ink, not on paper, but in the posture of a man who refused to bend. And through him, in the rising posture of a continent that had decided enough was enough. The story would be told in many ways through whispers in villages, headlines in newspapers, hashtags online, and songs sung beneath starlit skies. Each version different, yet all carrying the same heartbeat. That day in Accra, Africa stood tall. And in standing tall, it reminded the world that respect, freely given and freely received, is the only respect that truly endures. And so the curtain closed on one chapter, only to open on another, brighter still. For history is not a straight line. It is a spiral, circling back on itself, demanding each generation choose whether to bow or to stand. Ibrahim Traoré chose to stand, and because he did, millions stood with him, their hearts pressed firmly to their chests, their eyes unflinching, their voices echoing into the future. We go as equals, or we do not go at all. That single gesture, a hand placed over the heart, instead of a bow, sent shockwaves across the globe. It wasn't just a moment. It was a message. Africa will no longer kneel. What do you think? Was Ibrahim Traoré right to defy the king's order, or was it a step too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation belongs to all of us. And if you want more untold stories like this, one stories the mainstream won't dare to tell, make sure you smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because we're just getting started.